I was about 6 or 7 years old after VE Day, Victory in Europe, and Japan was kind of a secondary goal. The U.S. was committed to help Britain and win the war in Europe before they turned their full forces on Japan. But because of that, Japan was still winning in Asia. So obviously, I didn't know about the planning, but we certainly heard about the results of the famous Doolittle raid, bombing raid on Japan, which was to send the Japanese a message: hey guys, we are coming for you. You're not invulnerable anymore. And it certainly sent that message, although it was great for American morale. But you know what seems to happen when you bomb an enemy in their home city? It makes their resolve even stronger. And we saw in Germany that, what's his name, the guy who looked like a rat, what was his name, you know?
Goebbels?
Oh, Goebbels. Goebbels says, we will go to total war now, total war. And so the Japanese militarists, when they got bombed, they had a similar reaction. We're going to do worse to the Americans. But the American people were never told that. And here's the story in brief of the Doolittle raid. Please, if I get something wrong, don't get all bent out of shape, because I haven't done any historical research. All right, this is just my memory as a 8-year-old kid, and then what we were told about that raid. So what happened was, in those days, aircraft carriers could only carry fighter planes. A lot of these small planes that might hold only one pilot, and certainly not great big bombers that had a ton of bombs and a crew of 4 or 5. But this Air Force officer, I think he's later General Doolittle, he did a lot, General Doolittle did, but he had this wonderful idea that an aircraft carrier could get close enough, loaded with bombers and extra fuel, to actually drop a few bombs on Tokyo. And boy, early in the war, after Pearl Harbor, the Americans badly wanted revenge. So what happened was, the plan of Doolittle was to load a small amount of bombers, maybe half a dozen, onto the deck of an aircraft carrier. And of course they could take off, but they could never land. They could never get back to that same aircraft carrier for 2 reasons. They didn't have enough fuel, and the second reason was they couldn't land on the aircraft carrier. They're too big, and there wasn't room for them. So the plan was to bomb Tokyo and then keep going into Chiang Kai-shek's Free China area and land there. Now, the general public just heard in America about the great success of the mission. Many years later, we found out that at least one or more of the planes had crashed. The prisoners were taken, the pilots. They were dealt with harshly. I'll use the euphemisms that are so popular today. They were dealt with harshly, so we don't have to go into blood and gore and torture. In any event, okay, my small audience is having a big laugh over that. In any event, some of the pilots did land in Free China, and they were, of course, big heroes. And so now I'm going to talk about the end of the war. All right, now the news from Japan after VE Day was, I guess the Americans got a lot of truth, because very good journalists went with the troops and came back with stories and pictures, and the American public, and I was 7, 8 years old at the time, so I guess you'd be surprised what a 7 or 8 year old kid can understand. Well, so we understood that the Japanese they just wouldn't give up. They would fight and fight and fight till the last person. And if they were surrounded, they'd raise their sword and yell "Banzai," and try to kill as many people as they could. And I do remember seeing a newsreel where a Japanese came out with his hands up to supposedly, and a white flag, supposedly to surrender. Then he bent over, and two cohorts behind him who were holding hand grenades threw them at the GIs who were trying to arrest them or detain them as war prisoners, and they blew themselves up, and a piece of the grenade hit the camera, and that ended the scene in a quite dramatic way. Oh, here comes our birds again. Oh, let's get them. Let's see if they fly away. See, they're so tame in Switzerland. They know nobody's going to bother them. So hope two of them said, well, we're going to have a trip. Okay, getting back. So the general public knew that it was going to be a long and costly campaign, because you weren't just going into one continent and having big battles. It was hundreds of islands, and with tunnels, and very well defended and well dug in Japanese. And not only that, even today we hear about the innocent civilians of Gaza. Well, nobody talked about the innocent civilians of Japan, because the Japanese had basically been all brainwashed that Americans were the reincarnation of the Japanese equivalent of Satan, and every one of them, as the poor GIs learned, was ready to jump off a cliff or die killing an American rather than giving up. So it was a dilemma, kind of like seems to be faced in Israel today, where the people on the other side have been told from the very young age that the enemy are devils, and once again, it may not be their fault because they've been miseducated, but people on the other side who have been brainwashed are not innocent civilians. They're ready to die for their cause. And in contrast, in America, as a little kid, we were not have any lost love for the Japanese, but it wasn't like we're educated to go out and kill them. So in any event, I later learned that Truman made the decision that there had to be a decisive victory, and he was going to use the atomic bomb, and if it killed 100,000 civilians, so be it. If that got them to surrender, it would be worthwhile. And once again, as I said, there were no innocent civilians. Obviously, if you're under 3 years old, you're not guilty either. But the point is, Truman correctly, in my opinion, decided that, boy, we've got to win a decisive victory and get a no uncertain term, unconditional surrender. So he dropped the first bomb. And guess what? No surrender. So the Japanese initially thought, whoa, those Americans, they only have one bomb, and now we're going to get even with them. But as it turned out, there were more than one bomb. I'm laughing, it isn't a joke. But the first bomb hit Hiroshima, the second one hit Nagasaki, and still the military wanted to continue, but the emperor himself was convinced that he should surrender to save Japan from utter destruction. And apparently there was quite a scuffle, and his own personal guard got the phonograph record of the surrender to the radio station, and it was broadcast all over Japan. And once the emperor, who was considered, I think considered not like a god, he was a god, once he said something, the war was over. Okay, so that brought about VJ Day. Unlike Germany, where all kinds of people were sentenced to death in Nuremberg, only a very few really brutal, evil Japanese commanders were sentenced to death. And there was a lot of discussion what you're going to do with the emperor, but it was decided that even though he was culpable, he would be allowed to stay on and be essentially an American puppet run by General MacArthur, who became the big cheese of Japan after the war. Okay, now let's go back to America as the war ended. Now, there was a certain amount of fear that if you have 1 million soldiers who are very experienced in combat coming back and facing unemployment, you could have a very difficult situation in the United States. But as it turned out, the returning soldiers had no taste for causing trouble. All they wanted to do was, well, make babies. And that resulted in probably the biggest baby boom of all time. Now, guess what? In economics, if you have new families being formed, namely boys and girls getting together and having kids right away, they want furniture, they want homes, and of course the men want jobs to make the money to support these things. And guess what? The economy had to do a quick gear shift change from an all-war economy to an all-civilian economy. So all the factories, thousands and thousands of factories making every product you can imagine, switched immediately to whatever they were making before the war, or in some cases new products using war surplus equipment and parts. And life quickly got back to normal with full employment. And another factor was the fact that because during the early years before the U.S. got into the war, they became the world's greatest creditor nation. They were making the weapons, the ammunition, the uniforms, the tanks, the cars for all the combatants, and they were sold for gold. And most of that gold got transferred to New York City, and what didn't get transferred was a debt. So all these countries like England and France owed serious money to the United States, which made the United States the creditor of the world. So besides having full employment and growth and lots of kids and new families, plus a lot of immigration, a lot of the so-called displaced persons of Europe now had come to America. So economically, even though there was a lot of fear in there, the usual gloom and doom people, the truth was the American economy was growing at a rate kind of like China used to grow, 9-10% a year, which is amazing, especially if there's no inflation. Okay, to close this segment, I'm going to talk about one other factor that nobody else that I've ever heard of seems to talk about, and that's war bonds. Now, during the war, all kinds of celebrities had big rallies, and even in my public school, the teacher told us that we should get our parents to buy a $10 minimum war bond. Well, $10 was, maybe like $100 or even $1,000 today. So it was serious money. People made about $20 a week in those days. So $10 was half your weekly salary. In any event, Uh, war bonds and the selling of war bonds was a huge thing. You couldn't get away from buy war bonds pitch in those years. But guess what? When people bought a war bond, which by the way we paid 3%, so you put in 7, and in 10 years you got back 10. But what's interesting is economists and not many other people know that war bonds had nothing to do with buying war material, ammunition, supporting the war. All that war bonds did was sop up excess capital, because people who were making ammunition couldn't buy ammunition. They wanted steaks and turkeys and and other things, and so the war bond money, the money that was going into war bonds, just stopped inflation. In other words, the money that would have gone to bid up black market products, a lot of it went into war bonds. So at the end of the war, with this great economic expansion, the American public was the only creditor of the American government. And as time passed, they cashed in their war bonds and were able to buy all the new civilian products and homes that were being built. In fact, one chap that I met at my college, his name was Levitt. He built a whole city called Levittown, starting right after the war. And this was just one of many suburbs. There was a move to create and move to suburbs right after the war. Before that, suburbs weren't very important, but after they were. And so we close with the fact that everything was going economically very well in the late 40s and early 50s for America. Great prosperity. Everybody was making money. Real salaries were going up. Ordinary workers would have 2 cars, a trailer, a summer home, and wherever they lived. So it was a very good time for everybody. And what can you always depend on? The government will screw it up. You see, you'll notice I said the word screw. I didn't say the forbidden word. Okay, so in the next 30 years, America goes from being the world's greatest creditor nation into the world's biggest debtor nation. And at the current the year 2024, we owe more than $1 trillion to other countries, and that seems to be unsustainable. So the way that kind of debt is paid off is with printing worthless money, that you pay off your debt, and that, in my prediction, is what's going to happen in the next 10 years. The value of the US dollar is going to go down. The only saving grace is that other countries are doing the same thing, and inflation seems to be the name of the game. So if you're watching this and you want my investment advice, get into hard assets. Real estate, gold, your own business. Can you think of anything else? Hey, my brilliant grandson can't think of anything better. So with that great advice, we'll say bye-bye.